life. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. Welcome to the first day of the festival in this brand new venue. I feel like I can still smell the biryani and the kebabs out here. It's my great privilege to welcome Pico Iyer back to the festival, because I think he's been here before. I also want to say that in a sort of roundabout karmic way, it's sort of fitting for us to be sitting on this stage, because if you'll permit me a moment of solipsism, it was about exactly 1 year ago that I was on a flight from Chennai to Jaipur to the previous edition of this festival, and I was leafing through a copy of Time magazine reading a column by Pico on India, and about halfway through the column I stumbled across the title of my forthcoming book, at that time forthcoming book, and it was a very generous sort of write-up of my book, of which he'd received an advance copy. And those of you who are authors know that the first review of your first book basically defines the rest of your life, at least psychologically. So, forgive the solipsism, but I just wanted to say that it's a privilege and an honor to be back up here and to have the chance to talk to him about his excellent book, The Man Within My Head, and more generally to talk to him about his work and his career. What can I say about The Man Within My Head? I mean, it's a wonderful book. It was one of my favorite reads last year. It's also a very mysterious book in a way, quite ineffable, even strange in the best sense of the word. And that's partly because it's a very complex book. I found it to be about many things at the same time. I mean, I guess technically or formally, it's a book about Graham Greene and Pico's relationship with Greene, or more specifically, Greene's work. But it's also about Pico's father, his relationship with his father. It's about Pico's own sort of quest for an identity, and of course it explores his familiar themes of rootlessness, globalization, spirituality, and as I said, one's quest for identity in a globalized world. So wonderful read, and I've read it 2 times, actually, both times on my iPad, I'm ashamed to say. I have yet to pick up a paper copy of it. Pico probably needs very little introduction to most of you, but for the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of you who aren't that familiar with his work, he is the author of 10 books, 2 works of fiction, 8 non-fiction. He's written a staggering 40 introductions to books. Some of his better known and best-selling titles include Video Nights in Kathmandu, which is the way many of us were introduced to him back in, I think it was 1988. The Lady and the Monk, Falling Off the Map, The Global Soul, and The Open Road, which was his last book, a biography of the Dalai Lama, with whom, by the way, he will be in conversation later today at 2:15 on the front lawns over there. Pico has also written for numerous publications over the years, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, Vanity Fair, and of course, Time magazine, where he's been an essayist for many years. He has been described as, quote, one of the most revered and respected travel writers alive today, though he might reject or bristle at the label of a travel writer. That's something we can talk about. He's also been anthologized frequently in the best spiritual writing, the best American travel writing, and he divides his time between a monastery in California and rural Japan, and I believe many airports around the world. So Let me stop talking now and move on to the reason
No, I
you're
want
here.
more. I love listening to this.
He has also been described as, let me stop talking and move on to the reason you're here, which is to hear him talking. We are going to do a reading at some point, but we thought we'd jump into the conversation, and the reading will come a little bit later. So, Pico, let me start by asking you, I said the book was ineffable and kind of strange in some ways, in the best sense of the word, and I think you sort of agree with that based on our correspondence. I mean, one of the reasons I found it so mysterious is partly because it works across genres. It's memoir, it's biography, it's literary criticism, it's travel writing. It's also about many things at once. It's really a very original book, both in its subject matter and its conception. And I was just wondering, how did it come to you? I mean, how did you conceive of this book in this particular form?
Well, thank you for all of that. And I especially love the word mystery, because I think it's a book about mystery. It's about what can't be said, what can't be known. I think Graham Greene, more than most writers, was fascinated only by what he couldn't put his finger on, or what he could never resolve, never settle. And in that sense, one of the challenges, obviously, of writing about such an author is to try to push into silence and empty space and try to get at exactly what can't begin to be articulated. So the clumsy way I went about this was to write 3,000 full pages, of which I only sent 240 to my editor. Some were fictional, some were non-fictional, many of them were rubbish, many of them were nonsensical, some were hybrid. I wouldn't even begin to tell you where the fiction began and the non-fiction ended. And it was all the way, I suppose, of forcing myself out of the linear mode to that more interesting domain that the subconscious creates. Because my sense is that anything that really matters to us, whether it's love or faith or terror, is precisely what we can't explain. And anything I could get my mind around would be smaller than myself and therefore not really worth attending to. So I loved what Zoe was saying just in the previous session about the move from journalism to fiction. And that's a move that fascinates me. I also want to say, just at the risk of embarrassing Akash, I'm so excited to be here with him. The very last time I came to India, I was flying all the way from California to Hyderabad just for 2 days, 15 months ago. And by chance, the day before I boarded the plane, I got through the mail from his American publisher a copy of his book. I spent 56 hours living it and steeped in it and reading and rereading it on the plane. And when I disembarked just after midnight in Hyderabad, not knowing who or where I was really stepping out of Akash's book and into his vision. It was as if he had prepared me for South India, and I felt that there was a lucidity and an honesty and a compassion, especially about struggling lives in India rising, that I wouldn't otherwise be able to see myself, that I really appreciated. I loved reading an Indian writer who cares enough about India to really question it, and a foreign writer who knows enough about the rest of the world to put India's aspirations into a larger frame. But we won't turn this just into a mutual admiration society.
So,
or
thanks,
an infomercial.
Thanks. I think the message is that the best way to read my book is when you're jet-lagged and totally disoriented and sort of skim through it in 50 hours. I think that's the basic message there. Let me, you were talking about your book not being linear. And I think, one of the things that struck me the most about the book was the architecture of the book, and the way you sort of slide between your life, your relationship with your father, and Graham Greene. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking, this could have been incredibly mechanical or programmatic, linear, to use your word, and in that sense it wouldn't have worked as well. But what struck me was how fluid it was, and how you interweaved these different narratives. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the architectural challenges you faced and how you overcame them when writing the book.
Yeah, well, thank you for the word architecture, because I think that's what I was thinking about more than anything. I think when I was a reader many years ago, I thought writing was about substance, the content. And the more I try it myself, the more I see it's really about structure. In other words, if one were to write an essay or a book about our conversation, the least interesting way would be a transcript or a chronological account. The most interesting way would be to go home 3 months later, try to remember one sentence you took away from this session, and then use that sentence to drill into what you can recall and what memory brings to the surface, with a lot of empty space around it. So my first book, which you mentioned, Video Night in Kathmandu, I was working for Time magazine at that time, and I was really packaged, so to speak, to go around places very quickly. I came to India for 2 weeks. I took 80 pages of notes. I went back to my desk, and I created a long Time magazine article, essentially, starting with a catchy lead, then taking one through ABC, and then finishing with a tidy resolution. And in this book, I suppose because I've lived in Japan for 25 years, one of the beautiful things about Japan, as you know, is that it's a culture that lives in silence. To some extent, everything that happens in Japan happens in the empty spaces, and it's not the words that are important, but either the intimations or, in fact, what is being pushed down. So in this case, architecturally, to use your words, I wrote maybe 150 different passages, some entirely fiction, some not. I almost literally put them down on my little desk in Japan, and then saw how many I could take out while still making an elliptical, suggestive, imaginative kind of structure. I spent 1 year, if you can believe it, taking out the subtitle of the book. So when I first sent it to my editor, it was called The Man Within My Head, Graham Greene, Hauntedness, and the Parents We Never Knew. And then I reflected on that for maybe 7 or 8 months, and I thought, no, let's have The Man Within My Head, an inquiry. And then finally, and this is how a writer works, it takes you 4 months just to take out 2 words, but finally, after 4 more months, I thought, no, The Man Within My Head, so that the reader picking it up doesn't know if it's fiction, if it's non-fiction, who the man is, what she's getting into. And I thought that that was a good introduction to the kind of experience that Greene brings home to me, and I was trying to share with the reader, which is one of vulnerability and not having a clue what comes next, and being kind of on your knees in a foreign city, not knowing left from right or right from wrong, and yet having to make your way through a darkness that you can't put your mind around. So it was hard, and I don't think I necessarily succeeded, but I thought it was an interesting challenge for somebody coming from a journalistic background. And all of you know, even if you've never been to Japan, that the power and the electricity of that aesthetic is you walk into a room and there's just a single scroll on a tatami mat. And because it's rather the opposite of the Indian aesthetic, which I think is about repletion and amplitude and getting as much as possible into a space as in the Diggy Palace today. In Japan, if this literary festival were taking place, that space would be silent and this stage would have nothing on it. And that would mean you would be attending to just this glass of water. Or the fewer things are in the room, the more you bring to what is left. And so what I was trying to do was, by taking out as much as possible, to charge what was left. I mean, this sounds very pretentious, but these are the mad thoughts a writer has when he's sitting alone in rural Japan, unable to speak Japanese for years on end. And try and create electricity between, for example, a moment in my life and a moment in Greene's life. And I think, because I was born and grew up in England, the main thing you learn there is your life is not important or interesting, even to you, but certainly not to the reader. So what I was doing for 8 years, writing this very tiny book, was almost sitting in one space, trying to find memories coming to the surface of me that were real events from my life, but that I felt would speak to some more archetypal story that anyone could relate to. So, for example, the opening scene in this book is set in the city named for peace, La Paz, Bolivia. The end of the book is set very close to the city named for peace, La Paz, because I think everybody's life here begins in a kind of peace and ends in a kind of peace. My book very carefully begins with what you could call a near-birth experience, a kind of dreamlike amniotic thing. It ends with a near-death experience. And at every point, in terms of the structure, I was not really interested in my life, and sometimes not even in Graham Greene's life, but in trying to spin a kind of Pilgrim's Progress, a life that anybody could hang on to.
Right. So, I have a confession to make, which I haven't told you yet because I thought you might email the organizers and get me kicked off the stage. But I'm not really a big Graham Greene person. Mm. Is that okay?
Yes.
But I mean, and I say that, I think it's important to say that because I still love the book, and I really enjoyed the book, and I think part of the reason is because the book is so much about Graham Greene, but it's also about so much else, and you build this whole edifice of other topics on top of your relationship with Graham Greene's work. And the question I really wanted to sort of ask you is a very simple question, but what is this book about?
It's about what you can't explain. It's about hauntedness. It's about the power of affinity. Because I think all of us know this sensation. You'll come into a space like this, there are 400 people there, You'll look into the 6th row and you'll see a face, and somehow you feel you know that person better than you know the friends and family that you came with. In the same way, I was saying to somebody about an hour ago, as a little boy, I would walk into a museum and I would see a Hiroshige woodcut landscape from 19th century Japan. And it would pierce me with this sense of familiarity. And I would see this very alien landscape and feel somehow I understand that place better than the street on which I grew up or the house where I keep my possessions now. And I think I think those relations have a particular charge because they don't fit within our explanations. And I think all of us in this space have these people within our heads whom we've never met perhaps, but we feel somehow they get us. They know us better than our own friends and family do. And I think that's what the whole business of writing and reading is about. I was just saying to somebody earlier this morning, you pick up a book and you descend for 8 or 10 hours into somebody else's head, a stranger's head, and if he has descended deeply enough into himself or into the characters that he creates, you come to know his guilts, his sorrows, his terrors, his sins, as you hope you will never know those of your own family or your own spouses. And so you form these very intimate relations with people you've never met and never will meet. And I was very glad that I never did meet Graham Greene, because I always felt that whether you like his books or not, a writer is giving you his soul on the page. And when you meet him at an event like this, what you're really seeing is his social self, which is not the self out of which the writing comes. And so I love the intimacy of the encounter that you have with a writer, which instantly takes you to a kind of essential discourse where you're talking about what you care most about in a way that maybe you never engage in with your friends. And so I suppose it's about intimacy, hauntedness, and the ways that we make these spectral connections with people who exist perhaps only in our heads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I found that notion of hauntedness quite powerful also while reading the book. And just to sort of quote one of the ways you describe hauntedness, you say it's there are people who seem so to stalk our footsteps that we can never be sure if they have slipped inside our beings or are we just drifting through their imaginations. And so this is your relationship with Graham Greene's work. I mean, you feel haunted by that. But of course, I mean, one of the things that this feeling of hauntedness does is it gives the book a very strong sort of mood and a feeling. And you know, that was one of the other things I found about the book, is that almost as much as the content or the structure that we were talking about, it was sort of pervaded by this mood that reminded me, you know, the sort of closest analogies I could find was Sebald, maybe V.S. Naipaul, the V.S. Naipaul of Enigma, of Arrival, possibly Away in the World. Were they influences when you were thinking about this book?
Well, they're heroes of mine, so maybe invisible influences, and you couldn't have said a more welcome thing. I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I think anyone picking up this book in search of information about Graham Greene should look elsewhere to the wonderful biographies that have already been published, and anyone who picks up this book wanting to learn about me and my father will be disappointed. But anyone picking up this book wanting to think further about the relation between herself and the things she can't explain maybe may feel a little gratified. And I think in my case it's not just a sense of being haunted by Graham Greene, but almost scripted. My sense often as I stumble through the world is I'm a figment of his imagination. He has somehow written my life. I remember once I was staying in this little town called Santiago de Cuba, in Oriente in Cuba, in a small hotel called the Hotel Casa Grande. And I walked out one morning and I got into a car, and the minute I did, a stranger slipped into the front seat and promised to show me around. Sort of disconcerting. More disconcerting when he turned around and he says, "Hi, my name is Faust." Most disconcerting when I went back home, and a few years later I was reading a biography of Graham Greene, and I read that 35 years before he had been in this little town, Santiago de Cuba, and he'd stayed in a tiny hotel, happened to be called the Casa Grande. And one morning he'd woken up and gone out to look around, got into a car. The minute he did, a stranger slipped into the front seat and promised to show him around. So clearly it's the only feature of that disquieting hotel that pervades. But I was sufficiently intrigued by this that I kept on reading. And a little later I read Graham Greene was making confession to a priest called Father Pilkington. And of course I remembered that the main man responsible for my spiritual welfare all the time I was growing up, my housemaster at school, was a priest called Father Pilkington. Not the same man, but of course not a common name. I went on reading. In the 1970s, Graham Greene came up with this crazy idea of writing a play about a very obscure 19th century romantic painter called Benjamin Robert Hayden. And I remembered at the end of the 1970s, as a foundering graduate student, I came up with this totally crazy idea of writing a doctoral dissertation on You Can See What's Coming, a really obscure 19th century romantic painter called Benjamin Robert Hayden. And at one point I had probably 60 pages of these correspondences in my book, and my editor said, you know, enough already, these mean nothing to a reader, they only mean something to you. But they were way into the fact that sometimes you will see somebody and the way he brushes back his hair or the way he expresses a sentence feels so much like your own. You think, I want to pursue this person, even if I never get to know him. There's something here that's a secret hidden in a box that will help me understand myself.
Mm-hmm. I just, you know, this notion of hauntedness, I found really quite thought-provoking when I was reading the book. And it sort of got me thinking, you know, do we all walk through life with these fictional or mythical or historical figures that in some way haunt us? And I'd never thought of it before, but I thought of your book, and I did come up with a couple who's, you know, I won't give their names here. But if this were a smaller audience, I would almost do a sort of TV talk show kind of thing and ask the audience to think about it and sort of name who they're haunted by. But, you know, just think about it. Are there characters you've read about, or, you know, historical, fictional, that somehow have played this outsized influence in your life? I found it a very sort of thought-provoking idea.
And I think all of us probably have many, many different people in our heads that speak for our different selves and our different moods. And one of the things that was interesting to me, goes back to what you were saying before, is that Graham Greene is not a very estimable character. He was tormented by doubt, he was restless, he was permanently fleeing commitment, he could never come to a settled relation with God or with the women in his life, he was often drunk. So he's not the kind of guy you would choose as a hero or a role model. And, you know, I wish James Bond were the guy in my head, or Marcus Aurelius, or some Thoreau or Emerson, who are two of my favorite writers and who speak for such affirmation. But I think one of the things I like about Graham Greene is that he brings great kindness to other people and unsparing honesty to himself. And I thought, well, that's an interesting challenge. He's actually speaking for those parts of many of us that we would rather avoid. And that's the direction, therefore, I wanted to go.
Yeah, it can be a little embarrassing to let people know who you're haunted by, right?
Yeah, it tells you everything about yourself, yes. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to name my ghosts up on this stage, you know.
But it's true. But if I met somebody and I wanted to know who she was, I would ask, who's your favorite movie star? Or a silly sounding question,
right.
But that would say much more to me about her than her resume or business card.
Right, right. Just one more question about this book in particular, and then we'll move on. I mean, the other thing that's obviously at the core of the book is father-son relationships, and you refer to Greene as at one point as an adopted father. And I think at some point I read somewhere that the subtitle was going to be something like "The Parents We Never Quite Know" or something like that. I mean, was that sort of long in conceiving? Have you often wanted to write a book about your relationship with your own father? I mean, or was it more that you came to your relationship with your father through Greene?
Through Greene, because I think when you start thinking about the fathers that you created in your head, it inevitably asks you, what about the father who created you? So indeed, when I began this book, the one thing I knew was that the title would have to be The Man Within My Head, because Graham Greene's first novel was called The Man Within, and I wanted to pay homage to that. And I knew that Graham Greene was that man. But the longer I went into this inquiry over many years, the more I did begin thinking about my father, and the more I thought, well, he's probably a significant man within my head whom I would never think to address except through the roundabout way of Graham Greene. And as I was saying before, there's not much about my father in this book, but what intrigues me more is that archetypal thing, which is that most of us, the males in this audience, know that when you're young, you think to define yourself, to make yourself, to establish who you are in the world, you have to go away from home, in the opposite direction from your family, and become something radically different. And then 20 years later, you listen to your own voice on an answering machine, or you see your face in your mirror, and you realize you've become your father, and in women's case, you often become your mother. And you rebel against your parents until you become them. And I think that's something that's intriguing to all of us, and it was the case with Graham Greene, because his father was the headmaster of his boarding school. When he was 16, he ran away from the boarding school. He failed, but in remarkable response for England in 1920, his parents sent him to live for 6 months with a Jungian dream analyst and the dream analyst's dangerously attractive wife. And so while his classmates were just learning about the 100 Years' War or reciting the Pater Noster, for 6 months, when he was 16, Green had only one duty, and that was every morning to tell his dreams to the analyst. And the dreams were often actually of the analyst's wife, voluptuous wife. And from that day on to the last novel he published at the age of 84, again and again, Green comes back to this central idea of a little boy walking out of his house, descending into a literally underground world, ruled over by a charming, colorful, probably crooked man and his mole, and is fascinated by these rival fathers. His own father was very upstanding and pious and innocent, and the father he chose was radically the opposite. He never forgot that his mother's first cousin, Robert Louis Stevenson, was the person who gave the world the story of Jekyll and Hyde. And his first title, The Man Within, comes from a 17th century quote about how each of us has men within who are going against our formal, official, public selves. In other words, the fathers that compete within us. So I thought, if you want to investigate Graham Greene, you have to apply those principles to your life.
Right. Well, let's move on from the book and talk about your work in general. You know, people often think about you as a writer about globalization, and I think you've described yourself as a global village on two legs. In The Global Soul, you write, "The question, where do you come from, is coming to seem as antiquated an inquiry as what regiment do you belong to?" So, I mean, are you a global soul, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I won't talk too much about it because, much to my shock and horror, the organizers of this festival actually have a whole session called The Global Soul on Sundays, so we'll probably be covering a lot of that. But what is interesting to me is not, again, my example, but the fact that if I go into any classroom in Toronto or Hong Kong or Sydney or Mumbai, Singapore, most of the kids I see are much more multicultural and international and omnidirectional than I am. And they have one home associated with their parents, and another with perhaps their partners, and another with the place they happen to be. And of course, you're an exemplar of this too. And another with the place maybe they dream of being. And their whole life is going to take the form of trying to make a stained glass whole out of these different pieces and to create a new kind of culture. And I think that's part of the excitement of this new century. So again, this was a way in the third week of this millennium of saying, well, something exciting is happening now in terms of all the traditional boundaries dissolving and people not being able to categorize themselves in familiar ways. And let's see where this could possibly take us.
So, I mean, I think one of the, you know, if people think about globalization or a global soul, one of the things that people would think about is a sort of affinity with technology and a sense of
Oh, no.
of always being on
Yes.
and always being connected. I mean, I think that's very much a defining feature of globalization today. Yeah, you're a little bit, you know, you don't Skype. He says he's never used a cell phone in his life, and you know, most sinful. I mean, I notice you're still using an AOL email address. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, are you? Can you be a technophobe and be a global soul in the way that you think about it?
Yeah, we better not get onto my VCR machine and the fact I still handwrite those 3,000 pages.
Cassettes.
And I have uncles, aunts, cousins, and editors in this audience who are unfortunately the victims of my not having a cell phone. So I do owe them an apology. But I don't think globalization has much to do with technology. And in coining the phrase global soul, I suppose a part of me was trying to say, we think of globalism so much in terms of technology, but if it really affects us at the deepest level, it has to be, what's it doing to our souls? How is it changing our dreams, our lives, our loves, the way we create or make music or make writing? And that seems much more fundamental than, in some ways, the vehicles or media with which we do that. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm in the 13th century and moving steadily backwards. But I suppose my only defense is, when I was in my 20s, I had an office on the 25th floor of Midtown Manhattan, 4 blocks from Times Square. I was writing world affairs articles for Time magazine, and so I really felt, well, I'm as close to the moment and the cutting edge and stimulation and this acceleration as possible, and I'm really learning about one side of life. But there's a whole other side that I'm not learning. And so I went straight from that office to a monastery in Kyoto, which I thought would kind of redress the balance and teach me what I couldn't learn close to Times Square. So having left Time magazine to go to a monastery in Kyoto, the last thing I want to do is reproduce Time magazine in rural Japan where I live. Mm-hmm. I guess at an early age I made the decision that I wanted, as I was saying about the tatami room, less in my life and more attention to give to every aspect that was still in my life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the other hand, you know, when I think about video nights in Kathmandu, that was in 1988, 1989. You were writing about kind of shrinking planet and the role that media was playing at that time, which was long before the internet. I mean, I wonder, you yourself may not have moved on into the sort of new era of globalization, but do you feel that you're somehow prescient at the time? I mean, did you feel like you saw something coming then?
No, I think just any of us who grew up between cultures, and again, you are a perfect example, Salman Rushdie is another, Savidya Naipal is another, is acutely aware of this new culture that's coming up in the passageways between places, not belonging to A and B, but to A times B or A plus B, or these new conspiracies and collusions between London and New York, or New York and Bombay, or whatever it might be. So anyone who's living it is attuned to it and notices it more than another person might. So I think no prescience, except it came to me with my inheritance, being born as a little Indian boy in England who was on his way to California. That willy-nilly was my destiny. And again, for all the technological changes in the world, I'm not sure the interaction between cultures has changed that much since 1985 when I made that trip.
Tell us, speaking of cultures, tell us about your name.
Yes.
When I see a name like Pico Iyer sticking to the technology thing, you know what I always think? I always think he never has to worry about somebody registering his domain name, right? Because you're the only Pico Iyer in the world.
Yes.
Akash Kapur, the minute Facebook releases an email, I'm gone. But tell us about your name.
Well, my parents were the prescient ones, and they gave me this wonderfully adaptable global name that could be Spanish or Italian as it is, or anything. And they probably intuited that I was going to belong in many places. And the last time I saw my mother, which was 10 days ago in California, I in fact more or less answered the question you just asked me. I suddenly said to her in delight, my name is Siddharth Pico Raghavan Iyer. So the first name alludes to the Buddha, the second name is a famous Catholic heretic, the third name is that of my father from a theosophical background, and my fourth name is a classic South Indian Hindu name. And so I said, there and then, at my birth, you were giving me access to 4 different traditions just in my name. And she looked bewildered and wrote me off as even more crazy than she thought previously. But I think that's because she had the wisdom to have given me that name in the first place.
So that's why you can still be on AOL, because you don't have to worry about anybody taking your name on Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo or whatever.
That's true,
right?
yes.
You can join us when you're ready.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you want to do a reading? No? Or?
Sure. I mentioned some of those correspondences with Greene that I found. And one of the peculiarities about Graham Greene was all his life he had a peculiar terror of seeing his house burnt down, which is exactly the kind of thing that never happens in quiet suburban England. In fact, that's why he fled quiet suburban England. But lo and behold, in the when he was in his 30s, during the Blitz, a German bomb hit his house, reduced it to ashes, and he never really settled to a domestic life again. Now, when I was in my 30s, one day I was walking up my parents' house, staircase rather, in their house in Southern California, and I looked at the living room windows, and I saw that we were surrounded by 70-foot flames, one of the wildfires that regularly tears through the Californian hills. And 3 hours later, the fire had reduced the house and every last thing in it, except for me, to ash. And I thought, my goodness, these correspondences with Graham Greene aren't as amusing as I had imagined previously. We rebuilt our house on the same property, as people do, for insurance reasons, and we were told, you'll now be safe for 30 years. It'll take a long time for the brush to grow back. But a few years later, we were encircled by flames again. And a few years later, again. And a few years later, again. And then again. And so I put an account of these fires at the very center of my book, chapter 9 of 17. Partly, of course, because these fires did make an impact on me and left their mark on my subconscious and imagination, but even more because I think everybody has a fire at the center of our life. Everybody knows that sensation of having the house that you thought you were owned and were secure in reduced to rubble. And of course, if you are His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or if you're a Christian mystic of the kind Graham Greene was interested in, all life is a burning house. So this is more about life than just about the particular incidents. There were fires raging all across the hills around our house, and I was sitting in a downtown restaurant with my mother and my wife, Hiroko. I'd flown into Santa Barbara 2 days before, and driving along the empty road that leads from the airport to our house 10 minutes away, I'd looked up into the hills to where the lights of our home shine alone on our ridge, and my heart had stopped. There were two bright blazes of orange cutting through the darkness with a speed and efficiency I remembered from the time when our home in the same location had burnt down with me beside it some years before. I accelerated wildly up the hill and started taking the curves along the mountain road leading up to our solitary house at a crazy speed. The air to the north was already red and full of smoke, and as I pushed the car to go faster, I could see sightseers along the side of the road, gathering to watch the unearthly light show, great towers of orange 100 feet high, rising from the valleys just below our home, and smoke turning the sky into a sickly pall. I swerved, brakes screaming, into our driveway and summoned my wife and mother out to see what was happening a mile or two away. It looked to be remote still, but I remembered how, during the previous fire, the flames had raced through the brush at 70 miles an hour, so that an orange gash in what looked to be a distant slope was suddenly a pillar of flames arcing over our living room windows. The next day, we awoke to the sound of helicopters whirring overhead. The sky was a grisly, blood-red color. The house felt hot already, and although the smoke seemed to clear as the wind shifted and returned us to a placid blue midsummer day, as the afternoon went on, the sky above the ridge next to us turned a hideous end-of-the-world color, or discolor really, ash falling around us like snow. I went with Hiroko down to the local post office, and as we came out after a short transaction, the whole suburb around us was black with coffee smoke. We looked up to the hills to where our house and our far-off neighbors were, and all we could see were 1, 2, 3 slashes of orange angrily starting up across the slopes. We began to drive home, and switching on the radio, I heard that our house and the few up the road had been issued an evacuation warning. I turned into our little road and began driving up it, and the announcer on the local radio, frantic, said that the evacuation warning had been turned into an order. We had to leave now, or we would be forced out. We drove the remaining 5 minutes at a crazy speed again, collected my mother, her dazed cat inside a little cage, gathered as many precious papers and photos as we could in 5 minutes, and then tore down the road again, fire trucks coming past us in the opposite direction, plumes of smoke seeming to rise from all the valleys and the crevices in the hills. The air so thick we were choking already, and driving out of what seemed to be an oven, the huge flames cresting above our house as if ready to engulf it. Now, barely 20 minutes away, downtown Santa Barbara was dreaming through another quiet, blue sky afternoon, a miracle of calm. The angry smoke and orange burns to the north seemed to belong to another universe. We had to go about our life as usual. The next day would bring a fireworks display along the beach for July the 4th, and the day after that I was due to perform a wedding ceremony for a friend who was flying all the way over from England for the occasion. There's a story of the Buddha, my mother began telling us now, perhaps to take our mind off the conflagration, and I listened to her, though usually all the wisdom that came from her, a teacher of comparative religions, I tried to block out because I was a son. When his closest disciple, Ananda, asked him what was the greatest miracle, she went on, walking on water or conjuring jewels out of thin air, changing the heat of one's body through meditation, or sitting undisturbed in a cave for years and years, he said, simply touching the heart of another human being, acting kindly, that's the greatest miracle of all. Ah, the Church of Humanity, in other words, I piped up, like Graham Greene. I didn't care that I was citing the very writer my mother had liked when I was at school, and I had mocked. You remember, she said not unexpectedly, who it was who told you to read Graham Greene. It was what he always believed in, I went on, the human predicament, the possibility for kindness and honesty, even in the midst of our confusions and our sins. He could never quite bring himself to believe in God. God was the other with whom he played his endless games of he loves me not. But in humanity, he had the strongest, if most reluctant, belief. In our fallenness lies our salvation. The other two looked at me blankly, nonplussed by this explosion, but what I really could have been saying was that we were now in the world he'd made so real to me in his books, at the mercy of much larger forces, pushed back to essentials, without a home. The only thing you could possibly do in such circumstances was see that so many others were in a similar predicament and reach out towards them. What you shared was not faith usually, but unsubtleness. Up in the hills, meanwhile, the fires continued to blaze. Thank you.
So that, I mean, I think that's a great passage because it summarizes so many strands of the book and of your work in general, including Buddhism. And your next talk is with the Dalai Lama. I was thinking, your last two books, this one and the previous one, have basically been biographies of a sort. The Dalai Lama and Graham Greene, two very different figures. Or are there similarities that most of us have missed out on?
I think there are similarities. I think every writer's dirty secret is he always writes the same book, but he gives it a different costume to pretend it's a different book each time. But I think all of us, writer or not, is carrying one single question through life. And I think both the Dalai Lama and Graham Greene are really about the issue of how to find clarity and direction in a confused world. And one of the things that most moves me is that both of them, I would say, are compassionate realists. They look really rigorously and hard at the world to see what it is and everything that's difficult or broken or fallible about it, and yet they still have hope. I think if I were to summarize the Dalai Lama's message in one word, it would be potential, that all of us have more potential than we know. All of you know in Graham Greene's books, the archetypal character is a whiskey priest who's drunk, who has a mistress, who does everything wrong, and in the critical moment rises to an act of kindness or selflessness that would put a cardinal to shame. I think also they're about rigorous self-understanding and forgiveness in many ways. And I remember one time I was traveling with the Dalai Lama through Japan, and I just read Patrick French's very wonderful book about Tibet, and I'd read a passage in which Mao Zedong said, if I say white is black, it's black. If I say up is down, it's down. If I say wrong is right, it's right. And I cited this to the Dalai Lama as an example of dictatorial indifference to reason. And he grabbed my hand like that, and he said, never say anything bad against Mao Zedong. He was saying this about the man who devoted his life to trying to destroy Tibet. He said, you can always blame the action, but never blame the man. The action is behind us, and we can find it unforgivable, irredeemable. But the man always has the capacity to become something else. So never say anything against anyone, however much he has harmed you or however atrocious seeming his proclamations or actions are. And of course, it was a very humbling moment, but it also struck me that's exactly the heart of Graham Greene. Actions are fallible. People have the chance to act better than they even imagine of themselves.
That's a wonderful anecdote, and strikes me that writers could probably get some therapy from the Dalai Lama about their reviewers and their critics, right? Just blame the act, not the reviewer.
Well, yeah,
right?
I mean, it's funny you say that, because sometimes people say, what have you learned from all these years being with the Dalai Lama? And one of the things is that I've learned to take reviews very differently. And if somebody, after I put 8 years into this book, excoriates it and says it's the most miserable thing on earth, my first impulse is, well, he's a journalist like me. He's trying to support his kids. He's giving an honest response as I do when I give critical reviews.
He's just a mercenary, you mean, is what you're thinking?
Well,
right?
if he is, I'm mercenary too. In other
Right.
words, he's nothing but a reflection of myself.
Right.
And therefore, it's crazy. And if I start thinking of it as an enemy, the first victim of that way of thinking is me. I'm only going to make my life needless misery.
Yeah. I think we have just maybe one more question. We were speaking of hauntedness and sort of influences on the book. I saw somewhere that you said the book could have just as well been about Leonard Cohen.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means that many of those 3,000 pages were once about Leonard Cohen and Graham Greene. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Leonard Cohen. I've learned a lot about Buddhism and monasticism and kindness from him.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at him and Graham Greene, both are not good at commitment. Both are permanently on the road to finding a more rigorous spiritual understanding, but never would want to settle to any. I remember Leonard Cohen once said, my art is about trying to write with compassion on deceit in the human heart. I don't think you could find a better formulation of Graham Greene's art than that. And to go back a little, if I may, just to Graham Greene and the Dalai Lama, I think one of the interesting, disarming things about His Holiness, whom we're just about to hear, is that some of you may know his most recent book is called Beyond Religion. And he, again and again, when he travels around the world, tells people, don't become a Buddhist. You don't even have to take on a religious belief or responsibility. The main obligation is the kindness and secular values that you can bring to the people around you. And he often says that religion is like tea. It's a wonderful thing that makes life tastier and richer, but the essential is water, which is just secular, non-religious values. And again, you couldn't find a better way of describing Graham Greene, who never really was ready to call himself either a believer or a non-believer, but I think administered, especially in his life, but also in his art, great kindness where he had no reason to do so. And believed very much in this rigorous practical morality of kindness being more important than belief. It doesn't matter what values you give lip service to. What matters is what you do in the here and now with that person whose hand is extended to you on the streets of Bombay or Hanoi or Havana.
That's great. Thank you. Should we do some questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open to the question.
Hi.
Hi.
I admire your work and Graham Greene's. So nothing better could have happened than you writing about Greene. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Having said that, as an author,
Yes.
and this applies to anyone who sort of bears their souls in their books, what does it really take to do that, to have the world see you in a way that you probably see yourself?
Yeah, well, Proust famously said the one subject you should never write about is yourself, because that's the one subject where it's guaranteed that the rest of the world has a very different opinion than you do. And so I think for those reasons, you're right. It's folly to write about yourself. And I would say the most fictional character in this recent book of mine is my father, and the second most fictional is me. I think one of the curiosities of writing is that, as I said before, you write from a very different self than the one you show public. And therefore, when you release a book, suddenly your friends become strangers and say, who is this guy? We thought we knew him, and in the book something different comes out. And suddenly strangers think you're friends because they say, oh, I relate to that entirely. You are my long-lost kindred spirit, as I said silently to Graham Greene. And I don't take either of those seriously. I don't take the self on the page very seriously, and I don't take the page in I don't take the self in the world very seriously. Somerset Maugham, who is almost Graham Greene's literary godfather, ends the Cakes and Ale by describing how he says there's one self who's the writer, who goes through the world drifting like fog with a smile on his face. There's another who's the person called Somerset Maugham, but the real being slips past unnoticed between the two. And everyone hangs on to the writer or the self and don't realize that something more mysterious is going on. So I don't feel that I bared my soul too much, and I've never done very much of that in my books. But it's interesting how one's writing can know one better than oneself. In other words, one can use writing as a searchlight trained into the darker corners of one's subconscious, because things come up. It's like recording one's dreams, and things come out of you on the page that you never knew you had inside yourself. And I think that's one of the selfish, tiny benefits an author gets from putting words on the page.
I just wanted to ask you,
Yes.
whether, what you call this hauntedness by another person is always limited only to the ideas. For example, I would like to know whether you try to know more of Graham Greene as a person rather than being, inspired by his ideas.
Yes.
Because mutually, Graham Greene might have known nothing about you
Yes.
unless you made some, effort to get across to him.
Yes.
So did you ever try that? That is one question.
Yes.
The second question is, Virginia Woolf wrote about, the novel of silence, that you could write a novel about silence. That is what is going on within the person. And the modern writers, the impressionists and all, they try to do that. Now, were you influenced by any of those writers? Do you think that you are continuing the trend which the modern novelists, inherited from Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and others?
Thank you.
Sorry, but can we keep it to one question? Because I think there's going to be a lot of people. Why don't you
All
just
right.
choose one of the
Well,
two?
I'll briefly say Virginia Woolf is a great hero of mine, and she said, always be yourself and never be yourself, which answers the previous question. And thank you for the wonderful thing about the ideas. I think what I was investigating was the Graham Greene who presented himself on the page, which is not just ideas, but sensations, premonitions, terrors, hungers. It's interesting, one of my very close friends is Graham Greene's niece, and in fact she has been my editor in Toronto, and she is the caretaker of his legacy and was very devoted to her uncle. And we had some public events after this book came out last year, and she said two things. The first the first time she met me 20 years ago, she said, "Oh, you and my uncle would have got on great together. I feel that you and he are really birds of a feather." She also, when we were talking on stage, said, "Well, isn't it interesting? Here's this very proper, tall, heavily drinking Englishman, and here are you, this small, scrawny Indian teetotaler. On the surface, you have nothing in common whatsoever." But the Graham Greene that I was responding to was only the one who exists on the page. Of course, I've done a lot of research into his life, and I feel I know quite a lot about his person through the many memoirs and biographies that have been written about him. But I was interested in that part of him that he chose to show to the empty room when he was sitting alone at his desk, if that begins, which is his ideas, but I think something deeper than his ideas. I would say his parts of his soul.
Mr. Iyer,
Yeah.
as a British child, American adolescent, Japanese adult, what is your advice for globalized children of the future generation?
Thank you. I would say not to fret about the things you can't do, but see the doors that this multi-homedness opens. Because I think a lot of people who have, in some ways, the blessing of connections with many cultures find themselves neither here nor there, lost between the fixities, and wish, understandably, that they could define themselves more easily than they can in the traditional way. Wish that, like their grandparents, they had one home, one caste, one nationality, one religion. But as with anything, I wish I were an NBA basketball player, but I'll never be 6'8" and I'll never be able to run very fast. So rather than wishing about the things that I can never be, look closely at the things that you are, that your circumstances gave you at birth, and see how they allow you to do things that maybe your friends would envy. And I think global children, who, as I was saying before, are often much more multiply homed than I am, have a sense of adaptability. They potentially have an understanding of other cultures, a moral sophistication even, because they're able to look around the corners of their assumptions that it's hard to do if you've always lived in the same town, surrounded by people very like yourselves. And the archetype of this, I think, would be President Obama. And I'm often impressed that the single best travel writer in America today, I would say, is the president. And it's interesting that the arguably politically the most powerful man on the planet now looks at every situation with the eyes of somebody who grew up in Indonesia, is half Kenyan, and was spawned in large part by the multicultural experiment that is Hawaii. And inevitably, somebody like him is going to look at the world differently from any previous American president. And I think he and many others like that, especially writers, because more and more writers turn to radical advantage the fact that, as Akash did, he can look at America with Indian eyes, he can look at India with American eyes, and whatever else he's looking at not just with Indian and not just with American eyes, but with a sophisticated mingling of both. So I'm envious of the children of the next generation who will have an even greater chance to push that forwards.
Hi, I'm Tamilian Iyer by birth, and I'm curious to take your global soul into a village in Tamil Nadu right now. And I want to know if you've ever wanted to visit the village your parents hailed from, and if you will ever consider writing a piece based on that.
I would dearly love to visit it, and I would probably never write it, because almost everybody in this room would be better equipped to write about a village in Tamil Nadu than I. Unfortunately, I can't speak Tamil. I haven't spent much time in South India. I would go as somebody eager to find out, but not eager to inflict my ignorance on others. And I think actually Akash's book could be wonderfully described as being the real story of a village in South India or in Tamil Nadu. But we have so many wonderful writers who know that subject inside out. I have nothing useful to add to that part.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
How do you do? It's wonderful to hear about Graham Greene. I'm a big fan of The Third Man myself. I was amazed to hear when you mentioned about your experiences moving from New York and all the way to Japan. It'd be lovely to hear perhaps your views on Hermann Hesse and Siddhartha. Would at all, if you share some, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I'm laughing because just 4 months ago I wrote an introduction to a 90th anniversary edition of Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. It was fascinating to read it at my age now because it had been a great talisman for me when I was a kid. When I was 17 years old in a very starchy 15th century English boarding school, we had something called speeches, where we had to stand up surrounded by busts of the distinguished old boys, Wellington and Pitt and Shelley and Fielding and many others, and declaim some speech. And almost everybody would read Caesar or Xenophon or Epictetus or one of these great monuments of the classical tradition. And I took mischievous, irreverent delight in delivering a speech from Siddhartha and thinking, well, you know, this school needs to come into the 20th century a bit, and I'll sneak in and contraband Hesse as a way of trying to remind it that the world has moved on a little since Fielding and Shelley. But it's interesting, when I was a kid, I thought the book Siddhartha was about the Buddha. And I thought it was about the enlightenment and understanding things that Siddhartha came to in the course of his wanderings. And when I reread it last summer to read the introduction, I realized, of course, that he only sees the Buddha peripherally. He's a contemporary of the Buddhas. He respects the Buddha highly, but he's on his own course. And secondly, that really the strength of Siddhartha comes from his mistakes. It's everything he fails to understand, all the things. It's a journey towards understanding the limits of your knowledge, not a journey towards knowledge, as I thought when I was a kid. It's a journey towards accepting and even embracing your ignorance and the fact that most things will always remain outside your understanding. So the more Siddhartha goes on, the less he knows, which actually brings us back wonderfully to Akash's first question. When I arrived in Japan in 1985, I spent 2 weeks there, and I wrote a 50-page article summarizing the whole of Japan. Now I've been there 25 years, and I could barely manage a haiku or a postcard. I think it's the same with the people you love. If you know somebody very well, the more you know them, the more you see how much will always remain outside your knowledge. And so that's what I took away from Siddhartha last time, that it's in some ways a book about agnosticism, not about faith.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end, and we've run out of time. So thank you all for coming out here. Thank you, Pico, for your answers and your wonderful reading.
And I'd just like to say two things. Thank you to Akash. He worked harder preparing on this over many months than anybody I've ever met before. And also, I think I see some friends in this audience who I'm keen to say hello to, but I have to race off to my next event. So anyone here who wants to say hello, I'm really looking forward to saying hello sometime in the next 3 days, but I can't do it right now. Thanks very much for coming.
Many thanks, Pico Iyer and Akash Kapur. Ladies and gentlemen, the